Okay.
The week before the first day of my first year of teaching, well, over a decade ago, was an exciting time. It was also stressful because I'm a bit of a perfectionist, but a bit of a messy, unable to decorate my classroom kind of perfectionist. Actually, maybe I'm not a perfectionist. I wanted to make my classroom inviting and exciting, and I really want my students to walk in and think, this is amazing. I could never make it look like what I imagined up. But the most amazing thing did happen in the week to follow. I knew a colleague who had a friend who had a son who was going to college. Confusing. But anyway, that son could not take his pet snake to college with him. Some rule about dorms and snakes. My colleague asked, would you like it? They said they can give you the cage and everything. It could be a classroom pet. I didn't even have to think about it, of course. So Spike, a Texas rat snake, became a classroom pet, an amazing, popular one at that. He was friendly, well, for a snake. He'd let you hold him and not bite. That year, I was the only one in the science wing with a pet snake, and I'm pretty sure there were some people that wondered, what was the point? Well, I'm big on relevance, so anytime I would teach a biology concept, I found some way to work in Spike. Predation? Well, let's talk about Spike's appetite for rats. Mitosis? Let's talk about why Spike even needs to make more cells. One day in tutorials, a student asked me, since Spike's parents were bred in captivity, did you ever see Spike's parents? Do you think Spike's parents looked like him? You can't ask a question like that and not expect an answer. It was a great question because we were getting close to our heredity unit. Heredity is about how traits are passed down from parent to offspring. We've made a playlist of our videos that focus on heredity, including reproduction, how to track inheritance and pedigrees, how to solve genetic problems in Punnett squares, and understanding different Mendelian and non-Mendelian inheritance. But you really can't delve into those and study heredity without understanding DNA, chromosomes, genes, and traits. And that's what this introductory video is going to focus on. So back to the student question. Spike has traits, patterns on his body, his size. These traits are coded for in his DNA. Some of the traits he inherited can be influenced by the environment. For example, if Spike had not had the nourishment he needed, that could affect his size. DNA is not just one big code buried deep down in an organism like some treasure. Spike's DNA is in the nuclei of nearly all of his body cells. He inherited his DNA from his mother and father. I can't know for sure what Spike's parents look like, but I do know that Spike inherited his DNA from them. One fun fact, many snake species can reproduce asexually. Had that been the case for Spike, he would have inherited all of his DNA from only one parent. But it would still be DNA coding for traits. Just like Spike, your DNA codes for your traits, and your cells can't function without it. DNA determines how tall you are, what color your eyes are, what color your hair is, or even if you're at risk for certain diseases. Also, like Spike, your entire DNA code is in most of your body's cells. That's why in those crime-solving shows, which we may or may not absolutely love, a criminal can sometimes be caught by just leaving a cell from a hair follicle behind. DNA has a beautiful structure, and that structure will help you understand how inheritance works. DNA stands for deoxyribonucleic acid. It's a type of nucleic acid. If you remember from our biomolecules video, nucleic acids are a type of biomolecule. Nucleic acids are made up of building blocks called nucleotides. Nucleotides have 3 parts. One of them is a sugar called deoxyribose. One of them is a phosphate. We sometimes say DNA has a sugar phosphate backbone. But the most important part of the nucleotide is the base, because the sequence of the bases can actually code for traits. So as far as the bases go, there are 4 types of bases in DNA. A lot of times they'll just use the letters A, T, C, G. The A is for adenine, the T is for thymine, the C is for cytosine, and the G is for guanine. These bases actually pair in a specific way, and there's a popular mnemonic that can help you remember which of them pair together. Apples in the tree, that tells you the A for apples, T for tree, because the bases A and T go together. The other verse is car in the garage, and that can help you remember the base C always goes with the base G. Regardless of whether we're talking about Spike or a plant or a protist or a human like you, these are the DNA bases in living organisms. but the amount of DNA bases overall and the sequence of those bases we mentioned will vary among different species and also among different individuals. But it's likely to infer that Spike has a sequence of DNA bases that is more similar to his parents than he would to, say, Rattlesnake. DNA has two strands, so there are nucleotides running up one side and there's nucleotides running up the other side. The bases are what pair in the middle. The bases are held together by hydrogen bonds. The DNA is also twisted in something we call a double helix shape. Portions of DNA make up genes. We can say, for example, that this part of the DNA here makes up a gene. Genes can code for proteins. Proteins have a huge role in expressing a trait. For example, let's consider your own eye color. Human eye color is actually pretty complex. It's determined by many genes. The genes can code for proteins involved in producing the eye color pigment, but proteins coded for by genes, they can play a wide variety of roles besides just your eye color. Proteins are involved in transport, in structure, in acting as enzymes that can make all kinds of materials, in protecting the body, and so much more. We do want to mention that not all genes are used to make protein, and there are parts of DNA that are non-coding. And even though nearly all of your body cells have your entire DNA code, your body cells may only use certain portions of those genes. Genes can be turned on or turned off by a variety of mechanisms. We call that gene regulation. Check out our video on that. Now, you have a lot of DNA. When it's compacted, it can be organized into a unit called a chromosome. Very helpful when you're trying to make more cells and you need to get the DNA into those new cells. Chromosomes in your body involve DNA wrapped around protein structures. Humans have 46 chromosomes. That means nearly every body cell in your body has 46 chromosomes. Human sperm and egg cells, on the other hand, each contain 23 chromosomes. So you receive 23 chromosomes from your mother, 23 chromosomes from your father to give you your 46 chromosomes, your genetic code. So let's do a recap of the big picture. Here's a single chromosome. You see genes on this chromosome. These genes consist of portions of DNA. DNA is made up of nucleotides, and it's these bases here, the sequence of them, that makes the difference in coding for traits. Whew. Understanding this foundation is essential for understanding heredity, whether you're talking about you or Spike. So this may bring up more questions now, like where do dominant and recessive traits come in? What about alleles, and how do you arrange those around a Punnett square? Well, you can explore those concepts and more in our heredity playlist.
All right, so I thought this video was a great recapitulation and sort of introduction to our conversation about inheritance and genetics. So let us extend this conversation now and see the connection between our cells, our DNA, and the chromosomes that each of our cells contain and how they dictate what we look like and how we function. So a few principles of heredity. And remember, I mentioned earlier that, you know, we're just going to kind of hit the surface with these topics in this course. It's an introduction course. You will take a genetics course where you'll get a whole lot more details about inheritance and genetics. So anyway, some of the objectives we want to take away from this talk today is that we want to be able to define some terms. I'm going to use a lot of terms today that you've probably heard before, but we want to make sure that we can define them and use them in context going forward. Genotype and phenotype, locus, allele, dominant alleles, recessive alleles, homozygous versus heterozygous. These are all terms that have relevance as we're talking about our genetic makeup, okay? We're going to talk about Mendelian genetics. So Gregor Mendel is one of the scientists that has been credited or sort of dubbed the father of genetics. He did a lot of studies with breeding and so forth so that we can better understand inheritance patterns and so forth. And so a lot of the things that he elucidated, we still hold to be true today about, again, inheritance patterns, predicting the probability of, you know, this phenotype versus another phenotype based on your genetic makeup. So anyway, these Mendelian genetic principles are those that you'll continue to hear about, and we'll take a look at some of those today. Some principles of inheritance. So, as we sort of already mentioned, we know that human characteristics such as our eye color and our hair color are traits that are passed on from one generation to the next, right? And so heredity, by definition, is the transmission of genetic information from parent to offspring, all right? That is heredity. Genetics, on the other hand, is a science, okay? Genetics is the science that studies heredity. Write those two definitions down and make sure that you can now use these terms properly. A lot of the times people use these words interchangeably, and they're not interchangeable. They're two very different terms that are related, okay? So genetics is a branch of science that studies heredity, all right? And heredity itself is the process of passing down or the transmission of genetic information from parent to offspring. And so what we now know after years of studying, and thanks to scientists like Gregor Mendel, we know that heredity typically follows predictable patterns in organisms, right? And so we know this concept of reproduction in humans. We know that's a form of sexual reproduction. We're using these gametes from both mom and dad. We've got sperm and egg. They both contain 23 chromosomes. We know what the chromosomes and genes are on each chromosome, so we can sort of predict the likelihood of certain characteristics in the new individual that is created. And we talked a little bit on last class about inheriting like genetic disorders and so forth. And so there are genetic testing that are available to do some analysis on the DNA and chromosomal makeup of that fetus in utero in order to predict the likelihood of certain diseases or malfunctions or abnormalities. All right, so heredity is the transmission of genetic information from parent to offspring. Genetics is a branch of science that studies heredity, okay? And so what we're studying when we're taking genetics is that we're better understanding genetic similarities and variations, okay? And so there are advantages, of course, to the variations that we might see amongst the population. We know that in the grand scheme of things, especially as it relates to evolution and evolving and adaptation, that variation is essentially provides survival advantages, okay? And so geneticists are concerned with similarities and genetic variations in a population, okay? So we can study these similarities and differences from mom to offspring, right? And we can also study it amongst individuals in a population. We might be interested in the ratio of individuals who may have this characteristic or another characteristics. And so we can study these with genetic analysis. And so the study of inheritance goes way back, and it began with the work of a monk, Gregor Mendel, who worked breeding pea plants, right? So he conducted a number of experiments and just collected this data over, several years, and all of the findings were sort of extended and, reproduced and studied and confirmed. And now we use the results of his work to sort of guide our understanding of inheritance. Okay, and we now understand a lot more about how this genetic information is transferred, from one generation to the next. So we're going to use a lot of the terms that we're getting ready to sort of take a look at today were derived from the works of Gregor Mendel. Okay, and we refer to those principles as Mendelian genetics. Okay, alluding to the fact that that information was derived by Gregor Mendel. Okay, so Mendelian genetics, you'll hear about it over and over and over again as you sort of continue to move through this curriculum, and particularly when you get to genetics. So some terminology as you work through your readings and so forth, there are some terms that you need to make sure that you're clear about in order to understand these concepts of inheritance. The first one is a gene. All right, we've been talking about genes pretty much the whole entire semester. This is a term you've certainly heard before. What is a gene? A gene is an inherited factor. We're clear that this is DNA, right? A gene is an inherited factor that's going to determine a characteristic or trait, right? On surface, we know that genes are just DNA, right? But as we're talking about inheritance now, we need to understand that these genes, this DNA, contains information, okay? And the information in this DNA is going to determine characteristics and traits about an organism or an individual. And so, because we don't all look alike, we all have very different traits as it relates to our eye color. We all have different hair color. We might have all different shades of skin and so forth. And so that lets us know that genes can come in different versions, right? Those different versions are called alleles. Okay, write down that term allele. An allele is a alternative or different form of a gene. And so, as it turns out, genes exist in pairs, okay? When you inherit the genetic information from your parents, you're going to inherit 2 copies of genes, okay? You can inherit 2 possible copies of that gene, all right? Or versions of that gene, and that's the allele. And so when Gregor Mendel was doing his experimentation with pea plants, he basically did a number of different crosses, right, breeding, and examine what the outcome would be, okay? And so in one of the crosses, he wanted to examine the outcome of the seed in terms of its shape, okay? So the shape of the seed is a trait, okay? The shape of the seed is a trait that is determined by a gene, okay? Just like your hair color is a trait, okay? Your eye color is a trait that is determined by a gene in your body. So Mendel performed these crosses, and the shape of that seed, right, is determined by genes. And we know that these genes can exist in 2 different forms, and we'll call those alleles, right? So there are 2 different possible outcomes for this particular plant to have a certain shape, okay? This shape could be a round shape, right? Or the shape can be wrinkled, okay? And so this is a very basic concept that you should understand as you're getting introduced to heredity, okay? Alternative forms of genes known as alleles, okay, are different versions of a gene, okay? And so all factors, or, the factors that we can identify that are, genetically based, such as our eye color and so forth, these are factors that are determined by our genes, okay? And they can exist on 2 different alleles, okay? And I mentioned that concept of random assortment, or that crossing over being sort of a random process during meiosis, where these chromosomes, right, are distributed to these gametes that are being made in a random fashion. Okay, so you got these 2 different alleles that can dictate whether or not these seeds are going to be wrinkled or they're going to be, round and smooth. That's dictated during that distribution of chromosomes to those alleles, and we don't know which one you'll end up with, okay? And so we have these alleles, right, which are genes, right, different versions of genes that code for different traits. All alleles for a particular gene will be found at a specific place on a chromosome called a locus, okay? So the locus is the location on the chromosome where we will find that particular gene. So in one of our past lectures, I showed you a layout of a human karyotype where we can see all of the 23 pairs of chromosomes, right? So each one of our chromosomes have a specific number of genes on them, right? So I talked about the Human Genome Project. The Human Genome Project has sort of elucidated the content of each chromosome, like which genes are found on which chromosomes, right? And the particular place on the chromosome, the location, write down that word locus. The locus tells us the particular place on the chromosome where we can find this gene, right? So therefore, there is a specific place that we'll call the locus on the chromosome in the pea plant that's going to determine the shape of this seed, right? So Gregor Mendel is conducting these experiments. He's crossing these pea plants. He's doing some breeding, right? He is doing the first one to examine seed shape, right? There's a specific place in the genome of this pea plant where we can find the gene that determines the shape of this seed. Are we all clear about this term locus? What is a locus? Okay, it's the place on the chromosome where this gene can be found. All right, and so then when we're talking about our genes or the collection of genes in our bodies, that is our genotype. Write down the term genotype. Okay, your genotype is your set of genes that you have. All of the genes or alleles that are in your body is your genotype. We all have a different genotype. Okay. And when it comes to that conversation again about these alleles, which is just an alternative form of a gene, we know that our genes exist in pairs, right? 2 identical copies of an allele is the homozygous set of alleles. Okay. An individual has 2 identical copies of an allele, that is said to be a homozygous set of alleles. Okay. If an organism has 2 different copies of an allele, that is said to be a heterozygous pair of alleles. And in this case, you're looking at these prefixes again. In biology, we can learn something from prefixes, even if we don't know what that word really means. Okay. That prefix homo means what? What does the prefix homo means in biology?
Same.
Same. Okay. And what about hetero?
Different.
Hetero means different. Okay. And so one example that I like to use here that we can sort of all resonate with is eye color, right? You inherit these sets of alleles from mom and dad. You can either inherit 2 identical copies of the allele or 2 different copies for the allele. All right. And we'll get to the concept of dominant and recessive in just a moment. But for the sake of this example right here, we're looking at the genetic makeup for this individual. Individual A is said to be homozygous. I'm sorry, heterozygous, right? Because they have inherited 2 different copies of the allele that dictates eye color. All right. So this scenario lets us know that this individual can either have blue eyes or brown eyes in the physical sense, right? And that's going to depend on which one of those alleles are dominant or recessive, right? However, if we look at individual B, this schematic shows us that individual B has a homozygous pair of brown alleles. So what is the possible eye color for individual B, just based on this schematic here? What's the probable eye color for individual B?
Brown.
Brown. How do you figure that? Why did you say brown?
Because both of them are for the allele for brown eyes is dominant.
Well, yeah, 1, because it's brown eyes is dominant, but 2, because this is a homozygous pair of alleles, they're both brown, they don't have any other option to be a different color, right? So this individual is going to manifest with brown eyes, right? Now, but if we look back over here at individual A, Camila, as you were saying, there's another factor that we have to take into account. So this individual has an allele for blue eyes, and it also has an allele for brown eyes, right? So just looking at this, we won't know if this individual will manifest or physically have brown eyes or blue eyes. So this is their genotype. They have an allele for blue and an allele for brown. But we have some additional information here that tells us that blue alleles are recessive and the brown allele is dominant, all right? That's a term that we're going to get to in just a moment. But if I were to jump ahead, I'll explain that dominant alleles are going to be dominant. They're going to overpower that of the recessive allele. So anyway, in this case, individual A would have brown eyes because that brown is the dominant allele. All right. But the concept we're on right now is the concept of the genotype. Okay. You've written this term down. You understand that your genotype is the set of genes that you have in your body. All of the genes that are in your body is your genotype. Okay. Now, genotype often dictates your phenotype. Okay. Your phenotype, write this down. Your phenotype is the outward appearance of characteristics. This is what you look like from a physical sense. Okay. Physically and physiologically. I know oftentimes we don't always consider our physiology. Physiology is how you function, how your body functions. All right. Your behavior. These are all considered to be sort of outward manifestations of your genes. Okay. Your phenotype is the outward or physical manifestation of your genotype. So for Mendel's experiment that we were talking about with the pea plants trying to dictate what the predict what the seed shape would be, the round seed, the appearance of a round seed or that physical shape is the phenotype. Okay. In the theoretically speaking, your phenotype is determined from your genotype. So what you look like physically is in theory determined by your genes, your genotype. Okay. Now, there are exceptions. And I think she mentioned, one of the Amoeba sisters just mentioned it in the video, that there are factors that can influence or have an effect on your phenotype apart from just your genes. Your genes are not the only factor, but they are the most probable sort of cause and effect relationship, like what you look like, your eyes, your ears, and so forth. Those are determined in your genes. Okay. But environmental factors can sort of also have bearings on your physical and physiological and behavioral functions. Okay. So if you think about, and when you say environmental factors, like something I think about is like substances, legal and illegal substances, alcohol, drugs. Those are all sort of that can alter behavior or physiology of your body. So in a normal sense, you know, your body functions properly because you've inherited the DNA, your DNA encodes for protein, and things happen the way that they should. But if you have outside influences from the environment, such as, you know, smoke, drugs, chemicals, carcinogens, things like that, then now we run the risk of having abnormalities in behavior or physiology. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. So the main point we're making here is we're learning our new term. So we said our genotype was the set of all of the genes that we have in our bodies, and our phenotype we're saying is are the physical features and sort of behavioral features that we exhibit. Okay. And so the connection here, or the relationship that you should understand, okay, from a theoretical sense, is that our phenotype is determined by our genotype. So your set of genes dictate what you look like from an outward standpoint. Okay. Understanding that there are exceptions and that environmental factors can play a role in what we look like from a total sense. Okay. So an important concept that we want to understand here, because these are some questions that you could see later, is that only the alleles of the genotype are inherited. Okay, so you don't transmit your phenotype from parent to offspring, right? So you want to make sure that you don't say that incorrectly. Like, you cannot inherit a phenotype. So we're saying our phenotype are our physical features and what we look like. You don't actually inherit a phenotype. What you do inherit are the alleles or the genes of the genotype.
So I have a question.
Sure.
So let's say that a woman drinks while she's pregnant and then the baby comes out with like
like birth
I
defects
think,
or something.
yeah, like the
Mhm.
alcohol thing.
Fetal
What?
alcohol syndrome.
Yeah, what would that be considered?
Fetal alcohol syndrome. I don't know that that would necessarily be considered a genetic abnormality. It would just be more classified as a birth defect, I think.
Okay.
Yeah, that's not genetic. That is just something that's been affected by environment, outside influences or whatever. A
Okay.
genetic abnormality would be something like Down syndrome, because Down syndrome is the direct result of abnormal chromosome number. Okay. Individual who has a fetus with an extra 21 chromosome, I think, chromosome number 21. So we have all of our chromosome in pairs, but in some cases things go wrong and you get too many. In this case, too many is not good. And if you have an extra chromosome number 21, that child is going to have Down syndrome. That would be considered a genetic abnormality. Other things like dwarfism, I think mental retardation, things like that have genetic associations, but not alcohol, drinking while pregnant. But that will cause birth defects. Let's be clear about that. But it wouldn't be considered genetic. Does that kind of answer your question?
Yes.
Okay. All right. So now we understand the concept genotype, phenotype. Now let's look at this concept of dominant and recessive alleles, right? So we said the allele is just another word for our genes, right? It's a different form of a gene that's going to dictate the different versions of a trait that you can inherit. So dominant alleles are the form of the trait that is observed in the phenotype. Okay. So we saw individual A, right? I had that example of eye color. Your alleles exist in pairs, right? And individual A had a brown allele and a blue allele. Okay. That's their genotype. So physically, that individual can have either blue eyes or brown eyes, right? That is dictated by which allele was dominant or recessive. Okay. Our dominant form of the dominant allele is going to be the form of the trait that is observed in the phenotype. So if you were looking at me and you see that I have blue eyes, then you can assume that I had a dominant allele that was blue, that the dominant allele in the eye color pair that I received was blue. Okay. On the other hand, recessive alleles are the form of the trait that is masked or repressed. Write these terms down. We use the term repressed in genetics, right? So you inherit two copies of this allele. One's brown, one is blue. So you're going to physically have either brown eyes or blue eyes. If you have brown eyes, then we can assume that the dominant allele in that pair was brown and the recessive allele in that pair was blue. Okay, so that trait, the blue eyes, that form of the allele is going to be repressed or sort of overshadowed. Okay, and so the concept that we're understanding here when we're talking about dominant and recessive is that the only time that you see a recessive allele in an individual is in the absence of the dominant form. Okay, and so what that really means is that the individual is going to have two recessive copies of that allele for that trait. And I should have an example coming because I know we are visual. Yes. So dominant, recessive. The dominant allele is that which is observed in the phenotype. The recessive allele is masked or overshadowed, repressed. So an important concept, when two alleles of a genotype are different, only the trait that is encoded by the dominant allele will be observed in the phenotype. So let's look at these examples here, and we'll stop here today because we run out of time. Individual A, we have a heterozygous pair of alleles because they are two different alleles, right? This legend here is telling us that our blue allele is a recessive allele and that the brown allele is a dominant allele. So individual A is a heterozygous pair of alleles. What would be the eye color of individual A? Now, tying together everything that we just talked about. What color eyes does individual A have?
Brown.
Brown, because it's a heterozygous pair of alleles and brown is dominant. Individual B. This one should be easy. What color eyes does individual B have?
Brown.
Brown. And individual C.
Blue.
Blue eyes for a number of different reasons, mostly because there's two copies of blue, like if you just looked at it. But if you're understanding these concepts, we have blue as a recessive allele, but because there's no dominant allele present, this individual will have blue eyes. And this is the only case for all of these examples where the eyes will be blue because there is no dominant allele present. Do we understand that?
Yes.
Perfect. I'm going to stop here today. I think I have some concept questions. No, I didn't put any in. Hold on a second.